All right. Welcome back, homies. It is Wednesday, June 8th. Today we figured we would try to untangle the wild weave web thing
Something like that.
that is IPM, Integrated Pest Management, which is kind of a weird animal. And we are definitely different than the rest of the world on the approach of this topic. So we're just going to try and give a little bit of insight into how we look at integrated pest management and what that actually means. So, for me personally, when I came into cannabis, the mentors that I had did not do, forgot the music again, sorry about that. The mentors that I had did not just spray regularly. That was not even a thing that people did. The hydroponic mentors that I had would spray nutrition sometimes every day of the week they went to the farm. So the hydroponic mentors that I had would take whatever the recipe was in the reservoir. They might dilute it down slightly. They might spray it full strength. Some of the guys that I used to work with would spray every single day, full year nutrition, the reservoir mix that they were feeding during that time in the life cycle. Most of the people that I learned from 2009 to 2010, were only making limited efforts to kill pests. I'm not saying what they did was organic or delicious or would pass regulated testing at this point, but it was single action that was taken to manage pests, and they just were better at managing nutrition, so there were less pests. And that never left me. I've never came into this with an idea that we should be spraying shit 3 times a week. It was never showed to me by the people that I started with, and a lot of those people are still making major waves and influence in the cannabis industry. So for me, spraying pest control products multiple times per week was never something that I've been on board with or subscribed to or will ever subscribe to. We'll just get that clear from the beginning. Just kind of the short and sweet of it. Right now, cannabis is dealing with viruses. I will go to the grave with the assertion that that is mostly responsible or mostly due to the vast amount of shit that people are spraying their plants with in today's era. So I'm a firm believer that viruses are a reaction to massive amounts of toxicity in the plant. So just going to kind of throw that out there. I think the main point for us is, for those of you that know or don't know, we came from the soil food web camp. And so we're going to be diehard biology every single time. And so if you're in a living soil system, hands down, undeniable, the biggest advantage you have over any other cultivation strategy is that you can manage the microbes. And managing the microbes is your biggest
Asset.
biggest asset, 100%. 100%. And so we always start with correcting biology. And when Sarah and I first got into commercial consulting, that's what we did. We started out just tweaking the biology. We found that at every single facility we went to, we could eliminate powdery mildew from the building by dialing in the microscope methods. I guess that's the wrong set of words. By dialing in the microbes by using the microscope methods defined by Dr. Lane Ingham. And I'm going to go to grave with that one as well. So first up in our mind is always take a look at the biology, see what it's doing, and start to steer it into healthy directions.
Yeah. Which means you have to be measuring it. You have to be looking at it, measuring it. It just makes sense that it would be the biology in my mind, but I've been doing this for a while, so I understand, the core components that go into what creates a healthy cell and what creates a healthy organism. And that is, the crux of it is biology. So, they're the ones that convert all of these nutrients into the forms that the plant would need at the time that it needs it. So, every time that we look under the microscope and when there's something going on, there is a pattern and a trend that matches up with the organism that we're seeing and in the life cycle of the plant that we're seeing. So for us, it happens over and over again, and it's a pattern that repeats itself. And so that to us is truth.
Pretty clear.
So, and if that's how plants have evolved, it would make sense. So, You know, when it comes down to these microbes, you really have to get at least the base organisms there, that fungi and the bacteria there. Most people have the bacteria, not a problem at all. They're very easy to establish, very easy to get in high numbers. Most everything that we do feeds them. But if you don't have the balance with that fungi, then you're going to be swinging the nitrogen, the form of nitrogen that shows up in the soil, which will swing what the plant receives. So when it comes to nitrogen specifically, that's a very costly element for the plant. So it costs the plant a lot to get that nitrogen. So that's why it makes these mutual relationships with these microbes in order to get that nitrogen into the system. It doesn't have a gate, and it's not going to be banking nitrogen back into the soil. It's going to take up everything that you give it. So if you overdo it on your nitrogen, it's going to be a problem for you, and especially with the form of nitrogen as well. And that can be done, that you can overdo that with the balance of microbes as well going on in the soil. So these are the things that we come back to with anaerobic conditions and being out of balance in your F to B ratio, but mainly in anaerobic conditions. So the way that nitrogen moves through the system is a key component to learn about when it comes to understanding the cause behind some of these pest outbreaks and disease. So
I think what people don't realize is in a hydroponic scenario, the manufacturer of those products are choosing the form of nitrogen for you, whether you're in the grow formula or the bloom formula.
yeah.
It's a pretty common old school technique to only run the bloom formula with micronutrients and some other hardeners and whatnot, and that will grow a cannabis crop. Nobody that I've ever met tries to run the entire harvest cycle with just the vegetative formula. It doesn't work. For one, it doesn't have enough potassium to fill up the flowers and get a good yield, but people don't realize that the form of nitrogen is changing. And I suggest all of you go, the next time you go to your garden center or hydro store, look at the back of the A and Bs or the veg and blooms and see that the type of nitrogen changes and the quantity of that nitrogen changes. Typically, the ureas and the nitrates will be in the vegetative formula, and then moving into the bloom formulas, it will be an ammoniacal nitrogen. And in the case of the soil food web, that bloom formula nitrogen is produced by the beneficial saprophytic fungi. So if you are making anaerobic tea brews, if you're doing anaerobic ferments, if you are waterlogging your soil, if you are bombarding your soil with nitrates, you are literally forcing that plant to consume the vegetative form of nitrogen during its reproductive and flowering stage, which is the literal mathematical formula for powdery mildew in the flowering or reproductive stages.
Well, it's not necessarily, so ammonium is not necessarily produced, well, so part of this whole cycle is that in the nitrogen cycle, so the nitrogen comes in through the air as N2, right? It has a triple bond. It's a very costly bond to break. That requires an enzyme to do that amount of work. Those enzymes are made by a bacteria, rhizobium, azotobacter, some sort of, nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They make those enzymes, they break that bond. That nitrogen then gets into the plant takes it up, holds onto it, never gives it up. Then the plant dies, and it gets consumed by these decomposers, the bacteria and the fungi like he's talking about. Now, if the fungi are there in enough amount, they make acids. Those acids, like humic acid, fulvic acid, ulmic acid, those acids keep the pH down below 7, a certain threshold, right? So because that pH is kept at a certain threshold, the poop loop, when that nitrogen gets taken up by its predator and gets released in the form of NH4, ammonium, stays ammonium, and then completes the cycle, gets taken up by a plant or gets taken up by the bacteria and fungi again, and it keeps going around and around and around. That is mineralization. That's taking an organic form of nitrogen coming in through the air, converting it into the plant. Now it's organic, changing it into a mineral form, NH4, through that poop loop. It'll stay that form if you have the right balance of that fungi to bacteria ratio. If you don't have the right balance, it will be converted to nitrate. So this is important. And then, so if you have a lot of bacteria, the balance of the pH will be above a certain threshold, that 7 pH threshold. They make alkaline glues. They make a lot of alkaline glues, and they can reproduce in mass numbers. So if you start converting all of your ammonium to nitrate, now you have a whole bunch of veg formula in the system. If you then go anaerobic, let's say you bloom out, you fed a whole bunch of sugars or whatever, molasses to your soil, you've created a huge bloom of bacteria, they've consumed all this oxygen in the soil, now it's going anaerobic. Now you start to lose this nitrogen, it gets converted into gaseous forms and back out into the environment again. So it's this wicked cycle that is attached to this fungi and bacteria in this whole loop that you need to understand when it comes to managing this nitrogen in the system. So it seems harder than it is, but it's not. It's just about understanding what feeds the bacteria, what feeds the fungi, who's first to come back, what do we not want to do to mess up this fungi, proliferation in the soil, and that comes down to IPM management.
Yep.
Right? So most of the things that we do, especially in a fast-paced system, where we're, 3 months or 4 months in a harvest cycle, we're constantly in the soil messing with that fungal component. So we need to be proactive in making sure that we don't overfeed the bacteria, and we're also feeding the fungal component in the soil. Mm-hmm. So, and getting our predators in the system so that loop continues and continues and continues in the right form.
So in short, Sarah just explained scientifically why cannabis does not actually prefer a bacterial dominant zone. Yeah. There's a question, so hit the replay on that and back it up.
Yeah.
So there's a question about amino acid forms of nitrogen, like fertinitroaminos or one of those other types of products. So when we do an analysis of a feed that's built on those products, they're primarily nitrate, if not all nitrate nitrogen. One of the advantages of running the Organics Alive VN is it almost always comes half and half nitrate and ammoniacal nitrogen, but nobody knows that because nobody does thorough testing. What's interesting is that's considered a vegetative nitrogen product, but we use it all through the life cycle because it's half bloom formula. It's a fantastic product. So shout out to Organics Alive for producing that. We do still use amino acid nitrogens on very large farms. So if you're doing several acres, it becomes far more cost effective to use something like fertinitroaminos or another amino acid nitrogen product. But if you don't have the biology correct, then you are force feeding vegetative nitrogen during the reproductive or flowering stage, which is the literal mathematical cause for powdery mildew. Once there becomes an excess of nitrate in a reproductive or flowering plant, it's not utilizing that, and it becomes food for powdery mildew and vulnerability and susceptibility for disease. So in a really short fashion, if you balance the ratio between fungi, what we define as beneficial saprophytic fungi, which have certain characteristics defined by the Soil Food Web Organization, to the omycetes, that's hands down the clearest indicator of outcome in any measurement that we take. That one is so accurate. Yeah. So there's a lot of resistance to that concept. Keep in mind, it's also coming from people that aren't doing these measurements. Sarah has done more of these measurements than any other human on the planet with regards to cannabis, and I trust that she's right. So
I do a lot. I'll just say.
I
don't know if I'm like the top, but I
will take the claim that Sarah's done more than anybody else. Nick Tomasini's done a shitload. There are other people who are doing it, but just take our word for that.
So just to drive home that point, when we were on location at a facility who had gone through a a what do you call it, natural disaster, and they weren't actually able to, this natural disaster was a flood, mudslide type scenario. It shut down the facility, but it also, nobody could get access to the facility for at least a week. I think it was more than a week, right? So nobody's accessing the facility. There's a living soil facility. The greenhouse that it was in had, because of this mudslide and all this, disaster weather, it had also kind of messed up with the help me out with the shade. Is it shade cloth?
Was broke. Yeah.
So they would get these, poolings on the top of some of the shade cloths, and they weren't able to open them. They actually didn't even have power to the facility to open up and ventilate appropriately to the facility for quite some time. So like about 2-3 weeks, something like that. So when we came on board, we are doing measurements in the soil. We knew what it was before. We knew we're getting these measurements now. And it was really interesting, the line, almost like a line in the sand of, those soils that had a very strong fungal, what we'd call beneficial fungal population, versus those that had a weaker beneficial fungal population, and the threshold to which these omycetes would need to get to in biomass numbers in order to overcome and overtake and get this outbreak. So it was coupled with, there's a certain percentage of beneficial fungi to omycete level that then allowed these above ground perfect storm to happen, where the entire place just started popping off with powdery mildew. You can imagine that would be kind of the perfect storm. But those pots that had a really high biomass level of the beneficial fungi and not quite that high threshold of omycetes did not have an outbreak of the powdery mildew. It took them quite a bit longer to actually show any signs of distress than the other ones that, where it had plenty of competition. So this idea that, Dr. Ingham talks about, where you need to have this competition, that's why she has these biological minimums. You need to have a certain minimum met in order to be out of the danger zone for these pests and disease. And that's a very important concept, which is why you need to get it measured, right? So are you out of the yellow and red zone? Are we in the green zone? And then where do we need to go from there? So that's something that I would definitely advise for any of you that are trying to utilize the soil food web to, as part of your IPM, which I would highly advise, because if you can manage the soil food web and you can get those microbes established, that is your IPM, literally. And so we take a very proactive, preventative approach to IPM. Everything that we do in our program that we design, from nutrition to the microbes, the soil minerals, all of that is designed to be IPM itself. That's our biggest tool in the shed. Everything else is supplemental or a bridge gap. So, it's just telling us that there's something wrong in the system, something happened, we overlooked something, or maybe we've got, a pocket over here that's affected, like maybe we are not mixing our nematodes well, we're getting uneven nutrient cycling or something like that. It's just telling you there's an imbalance in the system, take a look at that, So
in the example that Sarah's talking about, there were actual holes in the roof where water was dripping on top of plants, and you would have a row of plants 120 feet long that was getting water dripped on them, and some plants would be exhibiting visible powdery mildew and some would not. So when we went and dissected that facility and sampled separately the plants that had visible mold and the plants that did not have visible mold, there was a clear line in the sand in the relationship between what we define as beneficial fungi and the omycete category. And once we really got quite good at managing that in a commercial facility, we almost never have powdery mildew at any of the farms that we work with. It's the easiest thing to get out of the building. You just need to get actual biologically complete compost into that system. You need to minimize the detriment to the organisms that you're inoculating and track the relationship between these two fungal communities.
Yeah, and that really is key, is making sure that you actually have the organisms there. You got to qualify it. If you're going to use it like an inoculum, you can't just hope or, somebody said it was good. You need to actually qualify it and make sure that it actually does have the numbers that it says it has in it. Either they provide that test, or you can count it, or you get it counted, something like that that you can rely on.
So with regard to actual pests and just managing it through the soil food web, keep in mind for the first couple years that we provided professional advice, we only managed the soil food web system. And by correcting those numbers, a lot of the problems did go away. Now, it wasn't magic, like we waved a wand, but most of the pest problems significantly lessened or went away until allowing the farmer to get on top of those problems by simply increasing nutrient cycling, by simply increasing nutrient storage, by simply increasing oxygen in the root zone. So when you're inoculating with biologically complete compost and managing those numbers, you're increasing oxygen in the root zone, you're putting the plant in control of what nutrients it goes after, and you're accelerating the delivery of those nutrients. So simply correcting the predator-prey interaction, so that would be something that eats bacteria. That could be a bacterial feeding nematode, that could be a protozoa, amoeba, flagellate, things like that. Just increasing those numbers will significantly improve your abilities to get on top of a pest issue. Now, the one kind of asterisk was thrips, or what people like to define as thrips. Typically, that's the hardest one for people in living soil to get over, because in my assessment, it's almost entirely due to the speed of delivery of nutrients to that plant with regards to predator-to-prey interactions, which is nematodes eating bacteria, protozoa eating bacteria, and the delivery of those nutrients. Most farmers are spraying so much IPM products, they never let these numbers come up into line if they're using biologically complete compost at all. So that's the one kind of caveat to things. We've worked with a lot of farms with this issue. The farms that are able to trust taking a break and spraying their IPM products and building up these numbers are able to navigate away from those pest issues. Those that aren't are not.
Now, when he says IPM products, this is anything from what we think is benign organic products to obviously full-on pesticides, but we're talking like all of it. So that's why it can be such a leap for people, because it's, we don't get in the habit of like just knocking back and causing an issue for the plant every time, and we probably don't even think of it like that it would be an issue for the plant. But if it's an issue for the microbes, it's an issue for the plant. So if you can think of it in those ways and kind of take that leap of faith with us, then you can start to see success. But like he said, if you're constantly spraying, neem is a common one that people spray on a regular basis, then you're never going to get there, especially with your fungal biomass. So
it's really difficult to communicate to farmers that their repetitive use of neem oil is actually causing the thrip issue. And it's happening because you're reducing nutrient cycling organisms in the soil, which is keeping the delivery of nutrients slower than the plant needs it. And something happens there physiologically with the plant, that there's either fragments of nutrients or missing gaps in the building of cells that then become the food source for that specific pest. Now, in the case of something like spider mites, it's typically a deficiency in calcium or an excess in nitrate nitrogen, which is quite easy for most people to do. Of all the clients that we have, spider mites is the least common pest that we run into, because we run fairly low nitrogen numbers, quite high calcium numbers, and then manage the biology in the soil. In situations where clients have had spider mites, it's typically in areas of their garden that they're not quantifying the biology and tracking it, or there's some other, small container type issue. We rarely
side project.
Trap plant side project. We rarely run into spider mites. We never run into russet mites. We never run into broad mites. So. Which I guess could bring us to the choice of IPM products. I've been following cannabis like an analyst since I started. It's just how my brain works, and I'm fascinated When I came in 2009, people were doing one single bug bomb application. And I'm not saying that that is great or delicious or tasty, but you're talking about one poison event. Now that we've gone into widespread legalization of cannabis, all of those chemicals are off the table. So people have switched to citric acid products, alcohol-based products, biotech products, and they're now using them much more consistently. Because if you were using one application of a systemic fungicide like Eagle 20, that's not great, but that did keep the powdery mildew at bay. The other consequence of that was that systemic fungicide was allowing you to create more of a powdery mildew susceptible plant through nutrition choices and high nitrogen applications that were masked by the systemic fungicide. So part of the problem is the last generation were masking the problems with systemic fungicides, and now those are being substituted with heavy repetitive applications of things like citric acid and rubbing alcohol and biotech products. I will take this to the grave based on our research that this virus issue is almost entirely due to the repeated applications of citric acid, alcohol-based products, and biotech products. When we lessen those products and we clean up the plant and we provide nutrition that facilitates detoxification, the virus symptoms go away. And being able to measure them on the tests goes away. Yeah. So that's a really tricky paradigm we're in, because now we're in this paradigm where you're kind of looked at like an idiot if you're not spraying bullshit 3 times a week. And that's the biggest problem. So we have to figure out other methods to manage pest and disease issues without spraying products. When we got into the regulated cannabis space, that was not an option. We had to do it with math. We had to do it with analytics. Hands down, the easiest way to clean up a pest and disease issue at a living soil farm is by cleaning up the biological component of the soil. The next thing is to back off the IPM products, which is a major leap of faith for farms. And you can't just come in as an advisor and pull away those tools and expect everything to get magically better. But things don't get better as long as the regular repetitive applications of these products continue. So
just creates a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Then you need it, then you have to use it, then if you don't use it, then you need it, then you have to, so it's just, the only way to step out of that is to literally use a different system.
Yeah.
Use a natural system, use microbes, and use them strategically. So, what's going on in ag is the same thing that's going on with every living species on this planet due to our management of the planet. So, I know physicians that actually use the same techniques that we use to heal people, to help people heal. So it's founded in truth and fundamental principles that apply to all living organisms. All living organisms need vitamins, minerals, and microbes. They need the whole suite of all of that in order to be healthy, to express the intelligence that's in their DNA. The organism knows how to heal. It knows how to be healthy. It just needs help getting there, especially if you are the human managing the system. Nature on its own, nature has its own time frame. It'll figure it out. It's been doing it in its forests and all over the planet for a very long time. And I know that this crowd, this is probably nothing new to you. And thank you for being here. Yeah. But this is such a paradigm shift for the majority of the people on the planet, and it's so simple. And it's just a matter of understanding what that nutrition and what that microbial component needs to look like in order to support the organism you're trying to help grow or heal.
So in order to jump ship from a barrage of poisons in managing pest control, there's 4 things that you have to manage. First and foremost, in a living soil system, you have to manage the below ground biological communities. That's the first thing that we do. Secondary to that is soil chemistry, which if you're relying on a bagged soil with a pretty label sold through the hydroponic store, that is the most dysfunctional soil chemistry. Yeah. And there's been other podcasts on it. I'm not going to go ahead and cover it. Bryant Mason did a pretty decent one with, I think it's Matt LaPont is his name. They went over 25 different soils that are available in a bag. You should at least check on that episode and look at the numbers and listen to their explanation of how horrendous that is. That's not something that I'm going to go ahead and recover. But plain and simple, the soil chemistry numbers on those types of products are trash. So now you're seeing an emergence of soil blenders aiming for this living soil market, getting more educated on the production of a soil that's more balanced from a soil chemistry standpoint. You're seeing smaller blenders here and there get it together. You're starting to see one or two major blenders get it together for the most part, but there's still, I still feel it's a necessity of the cultivator to manage these things and not rely on one soil test posted by an online retailer. That is not the soil batch you got. You have got to test that soil when you receive it. You need to manage this soil into the parameters which I feel are most appropriate, is managing the Malick 3 test and the Albrecht standards, slightly varied for potting soil numbers. But you need to manage that. And you need to be very diligent and disciplined in managing that. Because if you're not going to be very disciplined and diligent in managing the biology, you have got to have a PhD in managing the saturated paste test, which I have not found has been that practical in the cultivation space. Now, if you're not doing any soil chemistry management and you're disregarding biology and you start managing for the saturated paste test, you're going to have an improvement in results. And I encourage you to continue that, but then move on to managing both tests as well as managing the biological communities. If you're disregarding biology and you're disregarding soil chemistry, you will always have an underlying persistent pest and or powdery mildew pressure that will need to be managed. And so from that standpoint of not managing these two components that are essential, we sound like loony bins saying that you don't need to manage pests and disease. So the first step is getting up to board with that.
Well, yeah, and hopefully you can see
Excuse me.
that what we're talking about is the actual management
Right.
of pests and disease when we're dealing with nutrition and the microbes. That's actually managing pests and disease. That is the cause, is an imbalance in one or two or both of those things. So, we just take a different approach to it, and we, at first it was faith because we were like, well, let's test it out. Let's see how this goes. Let's just take this leap. And we did it, and over and over and over again,
Everywhere.
it proved out, even with just using the biology. Yeah. So even if you don't know anything about nutrition, the biology has a certain amount of buffering effect that it can do. Now they can't overcome too much salt in a system. That's just math and science on single-celled organisms and salt and the way
So
water moves in a system.
There's limitations.
Yeah, there's limitations, but there is a certain amount of biological buffering that will happen when you actually do focus on the soil food web. And then you can start refining from there. So if you're just jumping into this, I would say start with your microbes.
100%.
Start making sure that you're actually tracking that. Take one harvest and actually track it through from beginning to end, or even start where you are now if you're mid-season, because of where the time is June. So anyway,
It's a lot of indoor growers though.
Yeah, a lot of indoor growers, but just start tracking it, and then that way you can start to match what you are doing, your behavior above ground can start to be informed by what the microbes are telling you. Because you can think you're doing well, and you can think you're doing all these right things, but where does it need to be tweaked? Where does it need to be refined? Yeah. And that's what the microbes will tell you, and you won't know until you do that dance with them. So,
so number one is get biology together. Number two, if you get biology together and you disregard chemistry, you're going to amplify any imbalances and you're going to burn through the deficits quicker. So then the next thing is you need to then manage soil chemistry. The third component of that is third component. The third component then becomes nutrition. What are you feeding? Are you just water only? Well, in that sense, you're going to have low-lying pest pressure because you're not delivering enough nutrients based on how much demand on growth that cannabis plant is requiring due to how we grow cannabis.
Well, and the demand on the growth that the microbes will need if you want them functioning all the time for your plant. They need a certain amount of input into the system. In a natural system out in nature, it has all kinds of input. It's got animal poop, it's got insect poop, it's got animal bodies and insect bodies and leaves and plants actually going to senescence and seeding and then dying into and then feeding, the soil that way. That's all input into the system. We're removing all that. You need to do something to feed them. It can't just be, minerals. There has to be a certain level of organic matter. There has to be a certain level of input.
Nature is not quite water only. So
No,
you
not
need to
quite.
manage the nutrition. So whether you're doing a dry top dress strategy or you're doing a liquid fertilizer feed, which we do, we definitely see improved results with giving small, precise doses of a balanced feed regimen that we define as full fertility nutrition. So we're aiming for appropriate amounts of calcium in relation to magnesium, in relation to nitrogen, in relation to potassium, along with the trace minerals. If you're just, especially in the living soil community, trace minerals are almost completely neglected, and a lot of benefit can be had by supplementing the proper amounts of iron, manganese, copper, and zinc. Copper is essential for elasticity of cells and management of powdery mildew. So if you are lacking in copper, those cells are not going to expand the way they need to, and they might fracture like concrete, and then that becomes an exposed opening to powdery mildew. Along with all the other complex things we don't even know about, what these trace minerals do to provide immune system support. So getting in the correct amount of trace minerals is paramount. Having adequate calcium is paramount. In the considerations for dry top dress, every single dry top dress product out there is severely deficient in calcium. What you end up on the soil test results by constantly applying the same mix of dry mineral top dress of any of the packaged products, doesn't matter who it comes from, it can be a fantastic product, but the downstream effects are you're going to end up significantly deficient in calcium, too high in magnesium, and too high in potassium, and also likely way too high in nitrogen. Again, that is another mathematical formula for pest and disease. Once you drop below a certain quantity of calcium on the Malic 3 test, you are pretty much guaranteed to have pest and mold outbreaks. So you need to manage the nutrition that you are providing to that plant. One of the ways that we manage pest problems is by giving small, appropriate volumes of nutrients that do not antagonize soil biology communities that provide the balanced diet that that plant needs to grow each week. This is one of the most critical components of IPM there is, in my opinion. And we, because of our hydroponic background and our math background and our nursing background, we're really good at that nutrition strategy. So if you're managing biology and you're managing soil chemistry and you're being strategic with your feeds, if there is a pest and disease issue, you've now moved that variable into one or two things. It's now an environmental issue that's causing that pest pressure, or it is a watering issue. In the complexity of commercial cannabis, this is how we are so successful. By putting you into a balance of biology that we know is safe, by getting soil chemistry balanced and giving targeted feeds, if there is still a pest or disease issue, it has to be either environmental or water volume considerations. So then it becomes easy to just back the water off or make a change to the environment, and we can very quickly steer farms out of these pests and disease issues. But if you're not doing any sort of quantification or tracking of these components of the cultivation space, then it's going to be very difficult to get on top of pest or disease issues, and you will be stuck in a bombarding with poison scenario.
Yeah,
And,
I mean, that just forces your hand.
it forces you
that,
into
yeah.
it. And so as a small grower, I understand that's difficult. Most small growers don't do very much testing. Get active on social media. Find somebody that recently graduated the Soul Food Web School that's capable of doing the microscope. Try to get a bro deal. We obviously offer that as a service. There's other technicians that offer it as a service. Go through it yourself. Sarah teaches a class on microscopes where you can do this yourself. That's in some people's budgets, but not everybody's budget. We understand. And then at least do a Malic 3 test. At least do a $28 soil test. It's better if you can do a $68 Malic 3 and saturated paste test. Make sure you get the bulk density value. There's other videos on the channel that cover some of these concepts if you want to go deeper into it. And then from there, if you at least get those two components right, you will be in a much better position. And every single time we've corrected those two components, yield has gone up at least 30%. In certain situations, working with widely respected, famous living soil growers, we've doubled those yields. So there's a lot available to you if you do a basic test. So even if you're doing a 4x4 tent, we just had a client that has only had 2 harvest cycles under their belt, pulled almost 2.5 pounds, literal total. They're on their second harvest ever, just pulled almost 2.5 pounds out of a 4x4 tent. There's enough money in there for a $68 soil test. So, recycle some cans, mow the lawn, wash a dog, get that soil test in, find somebody that's willing to do a microscope assessment, or go all in and do one of our consulting plans.
I'll say though, when you're doing the microscope assessment, you're only going to learn so much from one. You really need to track it over time and see how that trends for you, and see how your behavior in the space and how you're treating the space really affects the soil organisms. It's very eye-opening to see, like, you could be thinking that you're feeding the organisms, but when you track it and trend it over time, that may not be the case. Right. So you just need to figure out, as you're teasing this out, a trend over time. The one bioassay is not going to tell you a whole lot. It's going to tell you where you are right then and there, but it's not going to tell you how your behavior in the space trends over time, if it actually lends itself to a robust living soil system. And that's what, if you're really trying to do this for a living, or trying to even do this because you're passionate about it, that's what you want to know is my behavior above ground, is my understanding about what I'm doing above ground matching what I intend to happen as a result below ground. So I just highly recommend you do that.
Very good point. We find the best results when we track it. When we first started doing consulting, we did a horrendous amount of microscope analysis of soils, and we learned a lot. If a farm has 4 beds in a greenhouse or a space, and they send us a microscope sample from each one of those beds independently, we can typically determine how they walk through that space to water and distribute their compost extracts if they're doing that based on the distribution of organisms. The information that can be had from this is insane. And the way that you walk through your facility and the way that you water and the way that you distribute feeds will have an effect on these organism communities. We've kind of backed it down to a bare minimum of you need to do it every couple weeks through a harvest cycle. And if you do that through one harvest cycle, you will be absolutely mind blown in what you can learn about what's happening. And so for us, that's a bare minimum. When we're working with a larger commercial facility, we do it more frequently. But we find acceptable, suitable results on the small scale in, doing it every couple weeks.
There's a concept that Dr. Arden Anderson talks about a lot, and I had just refreshed my memory about it just the other day listening to him. Really, really love his information. But he thinks like I do because he comes from the world of medicine as well. So there's this concept that a plant, any organism has really four levels of health. So at the very top, of course, is your highest health. Then below that you have pre-disease. So maybe you'll start to see a bug or two or a little spot or two of powdery mildew. And then below that you have disease, like full outbreak of pests or whatever. And then below that you have death. So most people, if you are spraying something or you're seeing an outbreak, you're at least in pre-disease or disease. So let's take that concept and let's multiply that out when we're trying to take clones, right? And we're trying to then fill a facility with a plant that's literally at either pre-disease or disease. Most people hover in pre-disease or disease because they're constantly spraying, they constantly have some level of outbreak, right? So that's where we're really at. And then those are the genes that we keep reproducing, and they can only be so strong, right? Because they're really not getting the nutrition. They're really seeing a whole lot of toxicity in the system, and they have to do something about that. And it just keeps degrading and degrading and degrading till soon we have to throw out genetics. And we think that it's the genetics issue when really it's
or somebody to blame for a virus.
Yeah, and the thing is that it's just the math of it. That's how it shakes out when when we don't reach for highest health and we don't actually achieve that highest health, and then we clone and we, grow to seed, and then we reproduce those seeds, and it's a cycle. And so for us, the only result we're really ever after is going to be the highest health above pre-disease. So hopefully that gives you an idea of why we're doing what we're doing, because you can get stuck in the short-term window of this is just this harvest and I have to make it through the harvest, and that may be the case, but long-term, what are we doing? You know what I mean? And the same goes with humans. It's that same Potager's cat that we talked about when we did the Arden Anderson episode on FCP. If you haven't seen that episode, that's a really great episode with Dr. Arden Anderson. And one of the things we talk about is this concept of this degradation in genetics over time, simply due to nutrition, degradation in nutrition. The genes now cannot express itself. Then when it replicates with missing letters in the alphabet, and then that replicates and missing letters in the alphabet, and then pretty soon you start getting that shake out with populations and diseases and things like that. This happens to be about cats, and it was a very simple study, but it shakes out every time. So that's why nutrition is so important, and a key component to that nutrition is the microbial component. They do so much for us as far as synthesizing vitamins, especially B vitamins. They inform genetics. They're constantly talking to the genes and protein synthesis and all kinds of amazing things that they do beyond just the management components that we're always talking about of competition and, nutrient cycling. Beyond that, they do so much more, which is why you don't want to stop with just 12 species of bacteria. That's like a whiff of the microbes that should be there informing your plant and producing these compounds for your plant and doing this buffering and this cycling that we're talking about. That's literally like 0.001 or even less than that of 1%, of what should be there that the plant should be able to have interaction with. All right.
Say it, sister. So the final component is equipment. So most people, especially at the small scale, have no clue that the equipment that they are using is nowhere near appropriate for actually killing a pest. And so what's up on the screen now is a color code for droplet sizes of nozzles for agricultural spray equipment. So if you are even a hobbyist grape farmer, for example, that runs 10 to 15 acres around your house, if you have a pest issue, typically you'll reach out to your ag extension agent office. They'll send out somebody to identify the pest. They'll determine what pest it is. They'll recommend certain products for killing that pest. And then they'll recommend a droplet size to minimize drift and also to hit the pest. In the case of a paint sprayer, which we all love, you're nowhere near the appropriate size of fine or very fine. If you need to hit a spider mite or a russet mite or anything, you have got to be in this very fine or extra fine. And a paint sprayer is probably way up here in this ultra coarse category, which if you think about like shotgun shells, so there's like snake shot, which is going to be like a bunch of little tiny BBs so that it can hit a snake, versus a single slug versus 6 shot. So, the smaller number of BBs you have, the bigger the BB gets, but the space that you hit will equal the space that's the void. So if you have, a 6 BB shotgun shell, man, can't get it out today, and then you have shotgun BBs this big, you're going to be missing that same size. So using a paint sprayer will never get you on top of a pest issue. This is the one matter that Susan Wainwright and I agree on. We disagree on pretty much everything else. This is something that we cannot get people to listen to enough. You are not properly atomizing or providing the proper droplet size to kill a pest. I can promise you there's no pump sprayers that you can get from the hydro store that's going to put a fine or very fine droplet size out there. Even with the paint sprayer, this other number over here is the mean variation. So in the very fine, you're going to range in 60 to 145 microns in size of droplet, which is also going to be the space in between the droplets. And so paint sprayers are way up here at, like the strainer you would use for your spaghetti or something, big old giant holes. And you're not going to come anywhere near the droplet size to effectively kill that pest. So then what ends up happening is people then go to more and higher concentrations, and now you're not only missing the pest, you're now further toxifying your plant. And so paramount for equipment is getting the right droplet size, which is honestly very difficult. When we work with facilities, they always ask us what equipment should we use. Unfortunately, there's very few pieces of equipment that actually do this. And so aside from the very expensive dram equipment that the lowest price model they have is about $1,500 to $3,000 range. If you get it in a cart, it's $3,000. This pretty much goes out of the range of any home grower and most farms. The lower cost equipment from dram tends to cut plants in half when people don't understand how to use the nozzle. So to have a safe piece of equipment from dram, you got to go up to their $3,000 to $5,000 units to get proper droplet size, homogenization, and atomization of that product. So the other thing is mixing. So on a paint sprayer, the big issue with homogenization. So, in the case of a paint sprayer, you're putting those chemicals into that bucket, and then as you're spraying, they're settling out. When we go to a commercial facility that's using a paint sprayer, you can tell the direction of travel through that facility based on where the burnt plants are. So you get hyperconcentration at the bottom of that bucket that burns the plants and makes it phytotoxic. So having homogenization and agitation of the mixing chemicals or pesticides that you're doing is also essential. So in the case of a smaller pump sprayer, you can just shake the snot out of it. That's pretty easy to do. But in the paint sprayer, you're just not going to get that. So at every facility we've been to that has a paint sprayer, they are burning plants and they're not killing bugs on the other side. So none of that is helping you get over a pest control or a pest issue. So in the case of a farm that's using a paint sprayer where they're not properly atomizing the droplet size or homogenizing that chemical, you're hitting bugs with water droplets, you're hitting bugs with super concentrates of pesticide, and then you have the big gap in between those big water droplets. So homogenization of that system is essential. So this is one that I designed to meet those needs. As well as together as well. So this is a very fine atomized droplet. So this is going to have the small enough droplet size to actually have effect against a pest. So you can adapt these spray nozzles to pump sprayers. We do have people do it. That's kind of a custom deal, which we're certainly happy to do. We can adapt the sprayer to anything pretty much as long as we know the hose size. But everybody loves paint sprayers, and the first time that I saw one, I loved it too. I was like, this is absolutely amazing. When we go to a commercial farm that's using a paint sprayer and we actually convince them to move away from the paint sprayer, which is actually very difficult to do, if you can get a cannabis farmer to move away from a paint sprayer and either go to one of our pieces of equipment or another commercial or another commercially appropriate agricultural sprayer that meets these same characteristics of droplet size, atomization, and homogenization, within 7 days, you'll cut the population in half, simply because you're now hitting them. So the consequence to a farm is if you're using a paint sprayer that's not homogenizing the solution, you are hitting plants with water and you're hitting plants with a concentrate. That concentrate is further making those plants more susceptible because you are further compromising their metabolism. you're further compromising the level of phytotoxicity that's in that plant. And so paint sprayers can be fine for nutrition. I would then argue that you're now having the same phenomenon with nutrition, which isn't great, but could not be less appropriate for pest control. Nobody ever wants to hear that, but that's the real deal. I scoured for a long time trying to find pieces of equipment that met all these needs, and they just do not exist below $3,000. We have purchased all these pieces of equipment. We've tried the different pieces of equipment that people use, and none of them meet these needs. So I fucking made it myself. We do sell these on our website. If you're interested in them, I did make a coupon code for anybody that is interested in appropriate sprayer. So for these, what we provide is we provide you the bucket. These are quick disconnect, no drip fittings, so you can disconnect the bucket, take it over to the sink and clean it out. With respect to biological considerations, you are making powdery mildew issues by not being able to clean out your tank. So being able to disconnect it, take it over to the station, wash it out, clean it out is essential. It's got the appropriate filter. It's got a 100 PSI pump. It does the recirculation. The only thing we don't provide with this kit is the cart and the battery. We also do make them in standard house voltage, 110 volt. We can do them either way. But this was the only way we could figure out how to get all these components of, homogenization, so actually properly mixing the solution, proper spray pattern. This was the smallest price package we could get all of these components of a $5,000 sprayer into these kits. So, if you're interested in this, we do, like I said, we got a coupon code, all cap locks YouTube. They've been working great at everywhere. I'm pretty proud of them, honestly. And I look pretty dead sexy as a model. So it's a 100 PSI pump. It has a visual regulator, so you know what PSI it is. And then you can dial it up and down and change the PSI. So if you're looking to spray biological things, you dial that thing on down below 60 PSI and you won't kill the organisms. If you're trying to spray nutrition or you're trying to spray IPM products and you crank that some gun up and get a really fine, really forceful atomized drip, all the sprayers come with 5 different tips that would fulfill the needs of everything from microfine to as coarse as a paint sprayer. So
and we built it to basically be a workhorse for us so that we could rely on something for both microbes and nutrition.
Yeah, and so it does both, right? So we don't particularly put too many IPM products through it. We mostly do biologicals and nutrition. This pump will also run 2 spray guns. So whereas if you look at like a Graco paint sprayer is usually between $650 and $850 per unit, they've never lasted a farm that we've seen, a commercial farm, more than 6 months. Most farms buy a couple of those a year and they buy a couple of them at a time. This sprayer will run 2 spray guns. So you can actually run 2 employees on 1 spray gun for less than the cost of 2 paint sprayers. And then the duty cycle on these are way greater. The one thing that people don't keep in mind with the paint sprayers is the duty cycle is usually only 200 to 300 gallons. That's crazy. A professional agricultural sprayer might be rated for 5,000 to 10,000 gallons. So, just some considerations there. So we got a couple questions here. We'll start getting into the questions. I've got a question here about beneficial nematodes. Mix them all together and spray them on. Is this all right or should I separate? So I'm assuming what you mean is multiple species. So you've likely bought multiple species. You mix them together and sprayed them on. If you're physically spraying them, like through a sprayer, we do have some hydroponic farms that do this. It's kind of interesting, spraying soil-dwelling nematodes on the above-ground biomass. It does seem to help. A lot of considerations, though. Is your pump killing them?
Yeah.
Is a good likelihood you've killed all those nematodes.
Organism. Yeah.
They're big bastards compared to everything else. So the pressure, a lot of times, we go through these exercises. We count the nematodes. We put the nematodes into the tank. We spray the nematodes. We catch the nematodes and we look at it. A lot of times they all look like, there used to be a guy on He-Man that had like a spring in his neck. I forget his name, but he would bounce around and hit his head on shit. Anyways, And they all look like that. They look like they've been in a head-on collision. And so you can spend all this money on nematodes and you slam them through a paint sprayer or something like that. They're going through 90-degree angles. Our sprayer doesn't have any 90-degree angles. So you don't kill the nematodes and the biology along the way. So I think how you spray them is important. Is it necessary to spray them? Now, he might be saying he used a squirt bottle and sprayed them on. In that case, that's our advice. Put the nematodes into as small a volume of water as possible. Put them into a small 8-ounce scientific wash bottle, or if you're a bigger scale, 16, 24, 32 ounce scientific wash bottle, sometimes called a tattoo wash bottle. That's the best way.
But apply them to the soil. You'll get the biggest benefit will be in applying them to the soil.
Yeah. And just a general comment that I would agree with. Most completely disregard how malnutrition is affecting yield 2 to 3 to 4 harvest cycles down the road. One of the things that I take great pride in that we are some of the best in the entire industry at doing is showing up to a facility, determining what nutritional balance is out, correcting it in a 48-hour period, and setting up that farm for new clones in 7 to 14 days. We are very good at that activity, and that is what has paved the way for our reputation of what we do in the commercial space. And so you don't need to repair the entire building. In the case of cannabis, if you can get 6 to 8 inches of very healthy, very complete growth, you can reset that facility to peak performance in no time at all.
So applying that principle to soil organisms ? Well, so peak nutrition can't. I mean, you're going to be doing a whole lot of work if you don't include nature's team to do that work for you. So I suppose you could try to get there without the microbes, but the thing is that you're never going to be able to do or guess what the microbes can provide. You just, I mean, think about it. These plants have very limited genes. They have very limited genes, and when you actually include the genetic potential, all the genes in the microbes, we're talking like 4 to 1 or more than that, or 250 genes to every one gene just in humans alone. So it's when we talk about peak nutrition and getting to actual nutrition and peak health, it must include the microbes. It has to. Otherwise, we're missing the entire point. So I don't know who Brian is and what a gold bar we mean by that, but if Brian agrees, great. I don't know
Whoever Brian
what else to say. Yeah.
So I think we got to about our hour mark. Just one more shout out. If you are interested in the sprayer, 10% off all spray goods until we take the coupon down. I'm a huge advocate of exact length hoses. So the way that I approach that is I would put a tape measure where the cart will be sit or mounted and take it into your facility and stretch it around the beds. A lot of times, we make like 83-foot hoses or 29-foot hoses. We do sell them in standard sizes, 25, 50, 75, 100 foot. I prefer to send you the exact length hose that you need so that there's no wasted kink. It just makes it way better.
Hose management.
Hose management is 30% of labor costs. So I'm a huge advocate of making them exactly the length you need. So hit us up if you're interested in that. I'll make you exactly the length hose that you want. I find that the best experience personally. So we hope we provided some value. We'll check you next week at the same time to talk about something else that we dream up over lunch next week. So hope you all enjoyed. Hope you've gathered some sort of benefit from this broadcast. Hope we didn't hurt too many feelings, and we hope to see you next time. You know the deal, homies. Thanks for tuning in.
All right.
Came in late. Yeah, David, where the shit are you, doggy? 2 hours late. You're supposed to be the first one. Come on. See you next week. Get it together. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Cheers, weed nerds.
Have a good one. See you later. Till next week.